Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Chris Jackson. And Fred and I were just talking about what happens when we have incomplete data. I suppose, what does incomplete data actually mean?
As opposed to not enough data or not enough samples, which is a different problem.
Right.
But this is prompted from a question I got the other day, and this was through the About page, which we often talk about as a way for you to get in touch with us, of many ways you can get in touch with us. But Alfredo commented that they have a piece of equipment that they know has been in service for 8 years. And they only have the failure history of that equipment for the last 3 years. And the question is how do you come up with a reliability prediction or reliability estimate or probability of failure, knowing that you're missing 5 years of data on that piece of equipment? Mm-hmm. So that was the gist of the question. What's the right way to go about doing that? But it brings up the bigger question is that we often have data that we know is not complete in one form or another. And so it's kind of prompted that question over to you, Chris, and I know that you've got a webinar coming up that's actually going to talk about dealing with, I think it was expert opinion or not expert opinion, making, I'm drawing a blank on what you phrased the name of it.
Now, I need to check it. Let me just go back through my notes and make sure I don't stuff this up, which is my want. How to take the guesswork out of expert judgment.
Expert judgment. That's the word. Okay. So it was, I suspect you're going to talk about Bayesian techniques of some sort or another, but the idea is that, well, sometimes the best data we have is, well, we think it's this. And sometimes we can, and then what you're going to talk about is basically, well, how do you do better at doing that? I suspect. But this question was they have a piece of equipment. He didn't tell me what it was. So let's assume it was, a piece of factory equipment of some sort, or maybe a big repairable system of some sort. And they only have 3 of the 5 years or 3 of the 8 years of information. And so I think it's good on him that he said, well, if I just analyze the 3 years, I will be getting an incomplete picture of what's going on. So that's the first stage of how to deal with incomplete data, is recognize that it is incomplete and deal with that. But what's your first take on this?
Well, I mean, it's the first thing is that well done for actually asking the question in the first place. That's one of the biggest things we want when you're talking to people about reliability engineering and coursework and things like that. You don't necessarily want people to walk away as reliability engineering masters. That'd be nice, but you just need to know when to ask. And this is obviously one of those times where someone realized, hey, there's something going on. There's some sort of breakdown in how we've gathered data. I need to work out how to deal with it.
Right.
So, I mean, if we look at it purely statistically, you have classic censored data, which is in this case left sensors. As a rule, we get right censored data where, for example, if we run a test and we terminate the test after 1,000 hours and we have a number of prototypes still working, that's right censored data. Their true failure points are to the right of 1,000 hours, because that's when you stop testing if they were still working.
Right.
But sometimes you have left censored data where you know that the thing failed before. If you have, hopefully our man might have data which says, okay, we did have these number of machines fail in the first 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. But you actually now have a really, I talked about left and right censored data. He may even have to treat this as interval censored data for many machines, because he knows they are working at the start or not working at the finish. either way, there's statistical things you can do to tell your model that, hey, this data wasn't observed for the first 5 years. But the other problem with statistical, well, that's not a problem, but that's how you deal with it. And you do lose information when you censor data, obviously, or use to censor data. But the other problem, I think you might be jumping onto this as well, is that 5 years is a long time, and the machine or the product our questioner is focusing on, that might have changed in how it fails. So the failure characteristics and trends in years 1 through 5 might be completely different to years 6 through to 8. So that's when you do statistical analysis, you assume that you're observing the same phenomenon or set of phenomena when you try to go outside your window of observation. So I suppose those were my initial thoughts when it came to the statistical challenges. But of course, you can also do things like expert judgment to fill in the gaps, and there are some ways you can do it where it's actually not as bad as you think.
Yeah, and that was basically my response. Is the data is left censored, and the statistics will attempt to fill in some of that, but it by no means will do a great job at it. And then the fallback is exactly the idea that it may well be a different type of failure mechanisms. And so understanding the nature of that equipment, what's like an FMEA type study will say, well, these are the types of things we get at installation and early use of this thing, or in different conditions and loads that we put on the equipment, or, how has the equipment changed over time, and how would that lead to different failure mechanisms? And using that kind of a look at the equipment and talking to the operators and technicians and repair teams, and go to your spares locker and look at what kind of parts were being pulled. If those records exist, they may not be the history of that equipment, but it might give you some clues as to the nature of failures that were occurring. But you can do some research for the people that have been in and around that equipment during that period, and get some anecdotal evidence, and then start to form both the engineering type look at, well, what could fail and what are likely to have failed, and then looking at the anecdotal evidence to basically bound where you want that to be. And so that was my approach, was, well, that it's likely that some things have failed, and that it's either assuming that there were none, or assuming that it just started at 3 years ago as a fresh piece of equipment, is probably going to underestimate what the whole picture is. And so filling in some of that with these other techniques may be the appropriate thing to do, knowing that it's still going to be fuzzy, but it's better than ignoring the whole.
Right. You don't want to ever throw away data. There's a saying that classical statisticians complain that there's never enough data, where Bayesian statisticians complain we don't use the data we have well enough. So there's information out there. We just need to be interested in finding it, and maybe pushing ourselves outside our comfort zones in terms of, hey, is subjective data useful? And the answer is subjective data is one of the best forms of data we have. Like when you are designing something from scratch, your design team is using their subjectivity to work out whether we should have a hydraulic pump versus a pneumatic pump, or all those little teeny tiny design changes or design characteristics. There's no algorithm for these things. This is all about subjective assessments about what is best for the design. Mm-hmm. So, moving forward, you cannot be a data snob if you don't have a lot of data. And as a rule, we don't have a lot of that beautifully formulaic, university standard, double-blind study data out there to help us make decisions.
Although there's plenty of factories and facilities that have terabytes of data that it's but it's from faulty sensors and ignored systems. And, we're drowning in data that we don't look at. And then when we sit down and look at, well, what's the record of failures for this piece of equipment, we can't find it. Either we can't find it or it doesn't exist, or we ran out of space so they killed that server, or, it's like, yeah, I don't know how many places I've been that they have a major expense just to gather and store all the data. And says, well, what do you do with it all? And says, oh, we keep it just in case.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. It's pretty expensive just in case here, guys. But I digress. So there's plenty of reasons for incomplete data. I mean, the team got their act together and decided, hey, we really do need to keep track of this stuff. And so that's a good change, or it was lost, or there was an acquisition and the records were not transferred over, or, there's a bazillion different reasons for this. Yet the knowledge within the organization probably can shed some light on it.
That's right. And I suppose we don't know what decision he's trying to inform. We probably should have started with that. Start this podcast.
That's true. That's true.
If he wants to know the reliability of this thing, is it to inform a life of type decision? Is it to inform warranty extension? Is it to inform spares projections, et cetera, et cetera? Because each one of those things requires different metrics. Spares projection isn't actually based on true reliability characteristics in a way. It's the frequency of failure sounds like it's reliability, but it's not necessarily. You might be interested in the failure rate as of today versus 5 to 8 year reliability characteristics, the probability of failure over that time. We need to know the decision that our man is trying to answer or inform, I should say, by doing this analysis.
Well, what you're suggesting is that the 3 years history might be good enough to know whether the machine is increasing failure rate or decreasing failure rate.
Right.
Is your current maintenance program helping or hurting the machine?
Are you interested in retiring it? Are you interested in, again, spares projection? You don't really care how it was behaving in the first 5 years. You want to know how it's behaving over the last 3 years. And when you do that, there's a good chance 3 years of data isn't bad potentially. So you might be able to project that out moving forward.
Well, that brings up, another technique is to, with a trained eye, inspect the equipment, because there are types of systems and parts that have, maybe a 5 or 10 year expected lifetime on the equipment. And they may exhibit the wear patterns that say, hey, it's getting close. We need to do something about it. So there's maybe some condition-based type stuff that you could use to inform how old is this element of the machine. Is this pump or brake pad or whatever? What is its current state? And use that to inform some of the opinion. The trouble is I don't know what kind of equipment it is. But if it's the kind that has like a 40-year expected lifetime, you may be able to, look at subsystems and work out how. It's like looking at a used car in the used car lot. If the dashboard is all dried out and cracked from sun damage, and the guy's saying that it only has 10,000 miles on it and was always kept in a garage, you kind of go, I don't think so.
Right. Yeah, it's again, but it comes back to the decision you're trying to inform.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We probably need a little bit more information, which is probably what the question is complaining about in the first place, not having enough information. But to answer the question better, we need to know what decision he or she is. I think it's a he is trying to inform, and that's a big deal. In many cases, you don't need to have the entire operating history of something to make a reliability sort of related decision moving forward.
Well, we also don't know. We got the note was that we have 3 years of history. But is this a piece of equipment that fails daily or once a year or hasn't failed in the last 3 years?
Right. If it's all survival data, that's another story as well.
Right. And the other way I see missing data or incomplete data is that we say we had downing events, say on a production line or a process system, and the failures cause the line to go down or the process to fail. But then it doesn't capture, well, what was the root cause of that? Was each of the downing events something different, or are all of the downing events the same piece of element of that system? Which is very informative if you're trying to improve the uptime of your equipment. Do you have a broad systemic problem across all of the elements of your system and it's just falling apart? Or is it really just you're buying the wrong bearings and they just fail quickly, kind of thing. So part of incomplete data, it can go in all kinds of different directions. But back to your idea that is, well, let's say that you're trying to figure out, well, what are the spares that we need going forward? And we have 3 years of data. Would that be appropriate?
Well, I mean, the spares, if it's the engine of a truck, which only gets replaced once every 3 years, maybe not.
Right.
Because you might have 0 failures or 1 failure, and that's not a lot of information to work out how many spares you need. If it's tyres on a mining truck, which you expect to go through pretty regularly, you should have a ton of data in that 3-year period. Is that broadly similar to your sentiment?
Well, yeah, but it's also, another piece that wasn't clear is that, well, do you have more than one piece of equipment? Like mining trucks.
Right,
do I have a fleet of those? And they're all at different ages. And because if I have 2 pieces of equipment and one of them was put in 8 years ago and I'm missing the first 5 years of data, but the other one was put in 5 years ago and I have the first 5 years of data, all is not lost if I'm trying to figure out, well, how do these things perform over time? Now, it doesn't take into account the 2 pieces of equipment were probably treated differently over time, but that's what you got. So you might be able to fill it in, or you have, back to the expert judgment type thing, you may have people that are familiar with this equipment from a previous work experience that in a similar circumstance, for example, saying, yeah, I commissioned some of this equipment and here's how it typically behaved over the first 5-10 years. But that's I don't know. Overall, it's what are you trying to decide? Is that, do you have enough information to inform that? And then expert judgment is your fallback, or I call it engineering. What are the likely failure mechanisms? If I know that I have wear mechanisms, let's go to physics of failure type understanding of it, right? If I know that I've got, regular maintenance records of this thing and I can track conditions of various elements of the system, by the analysis of that, I can determine its state. If I'm getting a lot of metal particles in my pump, well, we probably got something going on here. If I inspect the blades and we got a lot of cavitation going on, corrosion, we got something we got to deal with. I don't need a lot of history to know that doesn't look right. I need to fix that. If this seal is leaking, it doesn't matter if it was leaking 5 years ago.
And if you're interested in improving reliability, you don't need to measure it. You just need to know what your vital few are, which is one more consideration when we're coming back to what decision are we trying to inform with this data analysis.
So do we just completely confuse the whole issue and say, well, too bad you don't have enough data, deal with it?
I think it can be summarized like this. Our listener said, we don't have enough data, so what can we do? And we said, we don't have enough data about your problem where you don't have enough data. So here's tons of different things you can do. But I think the key message is, what decision are you trying to inform? Often we think reliability is vitally important to know and understand, to make decisions, but it might not be. If reliability is vitally important, then you're going to need to use statistical models where you have censored data, likelihood functions to incorporate the data and turn it into information. Otherwise, if you're trying to project spares, 3 years worth of data might be perfect. It might be great. In fact, if your machine has changed quite considerably from the first 5 years to the last 3 years, the first 5 years of data is irrelevant anyway. So it's just so many scenarios where it could change what we would suggest.
Yep. Well, I think the bottom line, though, is that there's many different options, from expert judgment to similar equipment to anecdotal evidence to all kinds of paths that you can sort out to, if you need a better picture of what happened in the first 5 years to inform your current decision you're facing, and then there are ways to get at it. We don't happen to have that time machine that says, oh, you can go back 10 years and train everybody about how to gather exactly the data that you need 10 years from now. So unfortunately, we don't have one of those.
My experience has been whenever I've had a client or a team or a group or an organization who say, well, you can analyze the data. It's rubbish. It's not very good. It's not clean. You know, the maintainers don't do a good job of putting stuff in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've always been able to pleasantly surprise people with what I can find. I mean, the two things I tend to do, I believe more than others, is that I take the time to try and find the right model and try and work out if there is a right model. You know, for one of my more recent clients, I was able to happily surprise them. And I said, all these failures you're seeing during your prototype development are clearly infant mortality. Why is that fantastic? Because these are the sort of things you'd expect when you're trying to improve your manufacturing quality. I haven't seen a single wear-out failure which suggests you're going to not meet your operational life of your product. So let's stop worrying about if things are going to accumulate enough damage to fail within the service life. Let's deal with the failures we've got, which are exclusively quality related or installation related or supplier relationship related. And that was, I think the data I had actually had 4 data points with out of a total of 10 devices being tested for all different durations. And one of them had 3 failures, some of them didn't at all. But you could show very clearly statistically that we know, for example, you said we were going to nerd things up before we started. But for those out there who know what infant mortality is like, you know it has Weibull-like intensity with a scale parameter of 0.4. All right, we'll stop being nerds. So I know that's the sort of trend I'm looking for, and lo and behold, it was those 4 data points fit it perfectly. And I was able to put confidence bounds. That's the second thing I always do after I try and find the right model. Put confidence bounds on and have a contour, a region of 90, 80, 70, 60%, so people can visualize the uncertainty in the data. And that helps us see what we need to see. I've always been able to surprise people with the amount of relevant information we can get from data which they don't hold a lot of hope for when they hand it over to me.
You've got a better track record than me. I've been handled just piles of random numbers on occasion and says, we need you to support this decision. And I'm like, all right.
I'm not interested in that sort of client where they've made the decision and they need you to help build a wall around their critical thinking. Bunker.
Well, that's kind of said facetiously, but it's back to your main point, Chris, is well, what are you trying to do? What decision are you informing here? What are you trying to track or understand or compare or whatever? And then start with that and then work with what you got, find a good model, understand that a model that's purely statistics may not be informative enough, and there are other methods. So I think we danced around this one about 15 different ways. And so if you've got a question that's similar to this, or if you got a couple other things you'd like to add to the mix of this, or or just have a different question. As always, please let us know. Join the conversation. You can do that over at accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. And you can find Chris and I and the other hosts of the show on LinkedIn and our About pages where this question happened to come through. So we certainly appreciate that and look forward to hearing from you. So, Chris, I'm going to go look for more data today.
Good luck. And if you find it, becomes expert judgment.
There you go.
By definition.
All right. Cool. Thanks, Chris. Talk to you later.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.